Hello and welcome to another episode of the Bear Business Podcast with me, Chris Barnard from feedbackfans.com. Today I speak to Adam Wright, Head of Commercial at award-winning St. Neots-based net zero and sustainability consultancy, Energise. We discuss the role of business in helping reach sustainability targets, how you can adapt your business to be more sustainable, and we'll touch on wider sustainability topics such as the growing importance of social sustainability within workplace culture. Adam, would you like to give us a bit of background on yourself and Energise and how the company has evolved since 2008?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Really pleased to be here. So Energise started business as a energy consultancy in 2008. I joined in 2018, so kind of 10 years into its inception. My background actually is in electrical engineering, and I studied electrical engineering at college as part of an apprenticeship with a pretty large multinational engineering firm. Interestingly, my background was that I'd spent 8 or so years designing, building and selling control systems for oil and gas platforms and gas pipelines, that type of thing. But the opportunity came about to join Energise, which kind of aligned to my passions to shift from energy engineering to energy efficiency, and I've continued the journey with Energise to move into being more sustainability focused, and that's how Energise has evolved. So Energise started off as a very small organisation on a dining room table with our 2 co-CEOs, Simon and Tamsin, as they were kind of just leaving university and realised that they wanted to create a business that was a force for good, that took on the challenge of climate change, but also brought along cultural change with that as well. Since then, we've developed to provide all sorts of services that are focused on sustainability, whether that's energy efficiency, whether that's developing net zero strategies and supporting organisations on that journey, and then more recently supporting organisations with social sustainability and how do they increase the sustainability of their people and workforce.
I suppose it's quite an unconventional route, isn't it, to come from oil and gas and then to now be in energy sustainability? I suppose it's, I say it's unconventional. It's probably a great way to do it, right? It's coming from an area where they're talking a lot about sustainability and they probably see the winds changing and they're looking to conform. And so you've probably seen a lot of things that can change in those types of industries that would make a big difference if they got on board with a sustainability message, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've all seen that some of the large oil producers, so the BPs, the Shells, the ExxonMobils of the world, have all started to shift their business model to being more sustainability led. So we see in the UK Shell Recharge as an EV platform, BP Pulse as an EV platform, and it's interesting to see, having been in that industry, what the moves of these people are. And we've got to consider that whilst they're still shifting their business model, it may still only be front facing. And in the background, these organisations are still pumping out loads of oil and loads of gas and out from the seabed, which is obviously then being burnt and contributing to the climate challenge. So there is some, you've got to look behind the smoke with some of these organisations. And I think I can see that because I've kind of played in both sectors, but I think it's difficult for maybe the general public to see.
Some industries are certainly more sustainable than others. I was thinking about the other day, certainly around smoking. Smoking has obviously been something that started with tobacco is great for you a long time ago, and obviously it's absolutely not great for you. Just try and make that disclaimer now, right? But that was the marketing messages of old. Even going further back than that, I was thinking of morphine was sold in that way, wasn't it? In sort of a, I was going to say Dickensian era. Ed Bod's going to be like, you're totally right. It wasn't Dickensian, Chris, right? But morphine was sold in a way of it's good for you. Leeches before that, I was thinking watching House of Dragon the other day as they've got the leeches on the poor lad who's been scorched by a dragon. All these things that start with the messaging of we are a great business, we are going to help you, or we have health benefits or whatever, some magic elixir maybe. And then it goes into obviously times where there's greater research, greater understanding. Actually, no, tobacco is not good for you. And you get to a point where, okay, we need to stop people doing this, whether it's smoking tobacco or what. And it's interesting from a sustainability perspective, I suppose, that the people who are challenged with solving the problem in that industry are the people who have caused the problems in the first place, Adam?
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you look at kind of emissions from a organisation level and you trace their roots back, I guess... a carbon family tree, if you like. You effectively all of emissions come from a few sources, and those being fossil fuels, but also animal agriculture, and then land use change as well. So these big players who are contributing to those need to make changes so that we can then make changes further down. And obviously that doesn't stop us from making change. Now there are still things we can do. But there's a good portion of the actions that we take that are going to be driven by those people at the top of the tree, I guess.
And lots of businesses have been on a journey with sustainability, haven't they? I'm thinking back to my days in London, in the city. We used to talk a lot about CSR, which was corporate social responsibility, sort of 15 years ago. And then I noticed that wasn't spoken about as much maybe 8 years ago, and everyone was saying, it's ESG now, Chris, right? It's environmental, got it right, environmental, social governance. And since then, we've seen a lot of mindset shifts, I think particularly with COVID, a greater understanding of sustainability. And obviously lots of people talk about net zero now. So I wondered if you could just explain for our audience about net zero and the importance of a net zero strategy for businesses today, Adam.
Yeah, so globally we've got a target that was set by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There are lots of acronyms in the sustainability world, so probably referred to as IPCC, that we want to limit surface temperature change from a pre-industrial level to be well below 2 degrees, with the target being 1.5. And that means that we effectively need to reduce the damage that's happening in the atmosphere to stop temperature on the surface of the planet changing. And to do that, we need to reduce carbon emissions, any greenhouse gases. Generally, we refer to them as carbon, but it includes things like methane and complex gases like sulfur hexafluoride. So we need to reduce those emissions, and that starts with change at the bottom of the tree, and that's with people. But people can only make those changes if the options available to them from businesses are there. So business models need to shift so that they are providing more sustainable options, whether that's products or services. How they operate as a business becomes more sustainable. So switching from, if they've got a large fleet of internal combustion vehicles, how do they switch them to EVs and charge them through kind of sustainable energy supplies? And that means that, like I said, they provide more sustainable services to customers, to other businesses, and they're part of then a more sustainable supply chain. That all adds up. We then reduce overall carbon emissions, all kind of supporting that, achieving that target of surface temperatures being well below 2 degrees.
Yeah, I think historically it's always been seen as a preserve of the big corporates and the big enterprise, right? Doing this sort of thing, being involved in sustainability. And I think a mindset shift that's changed in the last few years, which has helped, is that people have realised that just because your contribution in the grand scheme of things might be small, it doesn't make it insignificant. Are you seeing that sort of mind shift change in the businesses you're talking to, Adam, in terms of sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned before about large organisations talking about CSR, and that shifted to ESG. So it's probably fair to say that larger organisations whether it's because of a want to do it or if it's a need to do it because of regulatory pressure, they're probably 10, 20 years ahead. What we now need to do collectively is bring the smaller organisations along on the journey as well. And for perspective, in the UK, SMEs I think make up 99% of the total volume of businesses, about 51% of the economy, but then 44% of carbon emissions, non-domestic carbon emissions. So whilst there are lots of smaller emissions from smaller organisations, we need to take that collective action to reduce the emissions that are basically half of our total UK footprint.
It's a great answer, and you've raised two questions for me. One is, how do you feel as an industry in sustainability around government support for this? Because it makes a great point in my mind around enterprises are doing it. They'll have found ways of economies of scale with sustainability, and many will have found it, and no doubt will go on to this. They can use it as a sort of unique value proposition. Is there financial support for SMEs and those businesses, as you mentioned, a massive profile in how we need to win in sustainability? Is there support for them? Do you think there is enough government support for SMEs in sustainability?
At this point in time, no. There isn't really a huge amount of central government support. Typically, we see it being delivered from local authorities. So a lot of local authorities, so like Greater Manchester, for example, would have declared a climate emergency over the last few years, and that's them as a local authority are accepting that there is a climate challenge and they play a part in that. And their challenge then is to not reduce the local authorities' emissions, but reduce the area's emissions. That means they have to work with those small organisations to take them on the journey as well. And typically that's where we see funding come from. The funding at the moment, from what we're seeing, is in the identification of a plan, kind of developing your own net zero strategy. There isn't a huge amount of grant funding effectively for actually doing the work. And that's where we then see that organisations are kind of going back to shifting their business models, then have to increase their prices to cover that, to then make them more commercially advantageous.
It's something I wonder, it obviously going to be hard to tell as we have such a new government in the UK. I'm also wondering along that thread, are there countries that we see who we think are doing more, doing less? I suppose it goes with the zeitgeist, I've not used that word in a long time, the zeitgeist of the times and how people are feeling in moments such as cost of living crisis, cosy living, moments where the economy, inflation's high. I imagine these are the things that start getting set back, things like sustainability targets. We're starting to see that on a global level. Are there certain countries that you see, Adam, that you think are great sort of trailblazers in this space? And is there any you're willing to mention who are sort of lagging behind, even if it's ourselves in the UK lagging behind?
Yeah, there certainly is, and there's some really good reasons and considerations around it as well. The UK is definitely a leader in this space. We know that our emissions since about 1990 have halved, not necessarily that far if we go back to kind of pre-industrial levels. And being a leader in this space means that you're creating, you're being more innovative, and you're creating new businesses that are supplying this, and all of that supports the economy. Because if you've developed this technology through innovation, you've then got other countries that want to buy that innovation, and then you kind of support the UK's economy as a whole. It's interesting. There's a documentary series that followed the ex-US President Al Gore. I think he was the president. Not sure on my American history.
He was definitely the deputy at some point.
Maybe he was vice president.
Yeah, I can picture him.
So he joined the kind of UN conference in, I think it was 2015, when the IPCC's target of well below 2 degrees was set. And it followed him round having these conversations with leaders of countries, because the decision to apply that target would have been a vote for all the countries as part of the UN. So he went round to all these leaders of countries to try and convince them that it was the right thing to do to set this target. And some of the arguments that he has with countries that are a bit further behind, so I guess slightly more developed countries that are further behind, like the likes of China and India, they are currently kind of experiencing their peak of cheap energy by creating the energy from fossil fuels. We experienced that in the kind of early part of the 1900s, but these other countries are now having that peak now, and it only seems fair that they should be able to do that. But we need to convince them to maybe shift away from those fossil fuels quicker than some of the European countries and the Americas did. We know that China is developing really good renewable energy technology. They are pumping solar panels out like no tomorrow, and that's contributed to solar panels in the UK being cheaper. But the innovation needs to come from everybody. Everybody needs to adopt it, and we all need to work collectively together to make it happen. Going back to your point around, is it maybe one of the first things that drops if we are in a situation where we need to put money into, more immediate problems? It's a really difficult balance, and it's certainly not one that I would want to make. I don't. It's probably really difficult for the current government to make those decisions. But you have to consider what is happening now and what do we need to do now to stop things happening 10, 20, 30 years in the future. And I think one of the pre-election pledges from Labour was to bring back the delayed targets around EV vehicles and heat pumps, bringing them back to what they were before. So hopefully that's an indication that they accept that the challenge is still there. The impacts are still going to happen to us in the UK in 10, 20, 30 years time, and we need to take some action now to reduce the impact of those as much as possible.
I'm glad you bring up EV and heat pumps, because whilst listening to you there, I was thinking of certainly in emerging trends and popular things in business at a time, right? So I think arguably after AI, after video content that we spoke about last week on the podcast, now into sustainability, I think something that's so important in these things that are either good for your business, good for the world in your case, the communication and messaging is so important, and how it's delivered, how it's framed, and also how it is communicated for the mainstream, right? I think in AI circles, in large language model knowledge bases and people who were using it years ago, there is an incredibly people were so interested in how it was so adopted, so widely adopted as a new technology, which is usually you have a couple of the people who are willing to be first movers, try these things out, and then you get fast followers, obviously, and then there's a curve that people eventually go for something. And in a lot of sustainability chats over the last few years, it's been talk about offshore, onshore wind, big changes coming there, as I understand it. Solar panels, problems there. We have a gentleman who we have seen, this guy, I need to hire him for my business, Adam Wright. I've seen him on a roof in my neighborhood for the last 14 days, cleaning solar panels, because it's quite funny in this neighborhood, because everyone, as soon as they see solar panels go up, they don't seem to have been sold with whatever the care package is for solar panels. And so the pigeons around here absolutely love it. They go, live there under the panels, destroy the panels. As I understand, we have a couple of solar panel businesses we work with. Once you get a bit of damage on solar panels, it affects a lot of the capture and the battery. So then we go into EV vehicles, heat pumps still prohibitively expensive from conversations I've had with people about it. The battery factories, I think we've got one planned, have we? If we are leaders in sustainability, how sustainable is that? So how, from a messaging point of view, when you see these kind of, I don't know if we would class them as PR fails, but I suppose nothing is simple in PR, and certainly the PR listeners will be able to relate to that with us. But how frustrating is it when you see these kind of setbacks, and you can kind of get lost in sort of the nuance and the individualities of certain technologies, can't you? And forget about the bigger picture and maybe get held back. Does it cause problems for you? Do people raise these things with you, or are people more generally happy to go for sustainability regardless, knowing that there's going to be these sorts of natural issues as an emerging industry?
Yeah, it's a very different answer dependent on if you're talking to people, individuals, or if you're talking to organisations. I do find it quite frustrating, the kind of slow acceptance of some of the technologies. I would consider myself an early adopter of technology. I've got solar panels on my roof here. As we speak, my car is parked outside. My EV car is currently charging with a caravan on the back, and I'm ready to go on holiday. And I'm ready to adopt it. It all works really well for me. And going back to your point around AI, you, as a consumer, you can log into ChatGPT if you wanted to, and you can have a free go at it, and that could change your mind either way. You could either think, wow, this is fantastic, or you could think it's scary and you don't want to ever see it again in your life. I think it's harder with sustainability tech, because you can't just try things out. You can't just put a heat pump in your house for a day or 2 days to try it out and decide if you're going to spend thousands of pounds on installing it. Maybe you could do that with EVs, because you can go out and you can kind of test drive with dealers, but then is that one day that you test drive a car the same as every day in your life? Probably not. So it's difficult when we get the setback in the media around some of those technologies. I'm on kind of EV side of TikTok at the moment, and some of the comments are really challenging. People wanting to drive 500-600 miles in one sitting. I don't really know who does that. But then when you look at businesses, they've got the ability to take more of a risk, because it's easier for them to install some of this technology, and they're more likely to lease EVs rather than buy EVs, so that if it doesn't work for them, they can end the lease and they can switch back to ICE vehicles until the technology develops more, and then it's ready for them. So it's a really interesting conversation. If we look at both parties, the individuals or the organisations, some of the concerns raised in the media make it really challenging to then sell it as a way forward for people.
Yeah. And so I think we've thankfully reached a point where businesses understand they need to embrace sustainability, need to have strategies for sustainability. So it'd just be great to hear, just to make it more actionable for the listeners, how Energise assists companies in developing and implementing sustainability strategies.
Sure. So we adopt a framework that we refer to as the 4Rs. And the 4Rs is effectively a cyclical framework that you review every year. It's obviously a more of a task to create it in its first instance, but the review of it every year is much easier because you've already got your kind of baseline ready. And the 4Rs are review, reduce, renew, and rebalance. So the review stage is about understanding what are your baseline emissions. So doing that kind of calculation of your carbon footprint to understand all of the different sources of emissions in your direct and indirect control. Getting a high level understanding about what you can do about them, and then using that to set a strategy that says we will be net zero by 2040 or 2050, or some people may be brave enough to say 2030, but I'm a bit dubious about some of those because that's very fast. You then move on to the reduce stage, which is about how do we actually then make those reductions in our footprint. So how do we reduce our energy usage? How do we reduce our resource usage? How do we maybe not buy as many things because we don't need to? How do we, do we stop traveling to Europe to have meetings with people for an hour? Can we just do that over Teams or Zoom or something like that? And looking at your footprint and saying, these are the most intense areas, how do we then come up with an action plan to reduce those? And then obviously doing it. The renew section, the renew part of the framework is around how do you then have some innovation? So how do you look at renewable technology? How do you work with your suppliers to develop kind of innovation that you can then build into your business model and then reap the rewards of the reduced emissions? So for example, in large construction firms may work with concrete manufacturers to create low carbon concrete, which we've seen in recent years. And then the final piece is, well, we know what your footprint is. You've done the work to reduce it. you've reduced it even further with innovation, and then you've got that last bit left, and that's where you then look at offsetting options, which is typically tree planting or carbon capture, but you offset the final piece. Some organisations like to offset their entire footprint from the start. That's what we would call carbon neutrality rather than net zero, and that's fine if they want to do that. The messaging on that we've got to be really careful with, so we don't consider that kind of greenwashing as a reputational risk. But normally it's for the final part of the journey. You've reduced your emissions by, let's say, 80-90%. You've got 10-20% left. So let's invest in some carbon credits to remove that final bit of carbon directly from the atmosphere.
I suppose many people's only experience of sustainability, if they're a smaller SME, might have been coming across the tree planting companies that you mentioned. Because there's been a lot of popularity on that. That's become a very popular way for small and medium-sized enterprises, and a lot of bigger enterprises as well, have been doing that. Is there a reason why that has been what's taken off the most? I mean, obviously planting trees, everyone's surely in favour of planting more trees, right? We're all in favour of that. But that seems to have become the sort of populist way forward. Adam, is it as effective as it is represented to be, or how have you found that the growth of that industry?
Yeah, so there are two types of offsetting options. You've got carbon reductions, which is tree planting, carbon capture, and you've got that's carbon removals, and then carbon reductions, which is investing in schemes that will reduce people's footprint, but not necessarily remove it from the atmosphere. So those examples would be investing in renewable technology in developing countries, maybe purchasing cleaner cook stoves in developing countries where the emissions are reduced but not removed. You can buy those credits and you can kind of add them or remove them from your footprint. Tree planting is popular because it's physical. It's somebody can spend between £2 and £20 per ton of carbon on trees. Typically you would kind of, a bit like sponsoring a panda at the zoo, you get updates about your trees, for some of these offset credits. If you buy them through the right people, they will tell you where your kind of location of these trees are. If you ask for updates about how it's going, then so be it. There's lots of technical stuff around carbon offset. So typically a ton of carbon isn't offset via tree planting for about 40-50 years. So it's not that you buy a credit and you suddenly offset that straight away. You're effectively mortgaging your carbon over 50 years. And some of that maybe isn't necessarily apparent when people go to buy offsets through these organisations that are providing options for smaller organisations to buy them very quickly and very cheaply in some cases.
It's a great point, isn't it? Of course, a tree takes quite a long time to grow. People know about growing trees. So I think there is that people feel they have an instant gratification where they have, I've paid to have a tree planted, then I don't need to worry about these things. But obviously, it's got to take its time to grow and stuff. Would you be able to give us an example then? Could you highlight a successful case study where Energise has significantly impacted a client's sustainability?
Yeah, so we work with about 150 customers at a time, so trying to find the right person to talk about was a little difficult, but I've pinned out a kind of a high street name that hopefully some people will be able to resonate. So since 2017 we've been working with Revolution Bars, who some people may know as Vodka Revs or just Revs, from their uni days, but maybe as they get a bit older, some nice lunch during the daytime. So we've worked with them since 2017, and we took them through that 4-hour cycle. So understanding what their footprint was, how do they then reduce it, and then supporting them with offsetting at the end. Through that work, we identified that their baseline emissions were around 50,000 tonnes, which is, for the size of organisation they are, is typically expected, but that's across everything that they do. So the energy for their buildings, their employees commuting from home to the bar that they work in, all the stuff that they purchase, all the alcohol that they purchase or produce, and potentially their investments as well. So if they've got kind of large pension investments or invest in other organisations, what are the emissions coming from those? We work with them to understand how do they reduce some of that stuff through being more efficient in their buildings, being more efficient in their supply chain, offering options for reduced business travel, etc. There's a whole large action plan of things that they were tasked to do. Since then, they've reduced their footprint pretty significantly. So I think they're down about 20% at the moment, with their target to be down, I think it's 40% by the end of the decade, so by 2030. They do some cool projects as well that we've supported them on. So their Christmas menus and their cocktail menus, they aim to measure the footprint from those and offset those. And it works really well because of their predominantly student customer base, and we know that young people are more interested in sustainability and more likely to buy sustainable products. So having cocktail menus that are offset and carbon neutral is potentially a great sales piece on there as well. Another really interesting project that we worked on with is to consider removing the half a passion fruit that comes in a porn star martini cocktail, which, if you follow the journey of that, is grown overseas, harvested, put on a plane. In this case, it was on a plane, flown over into a warehouse, distributed to sites, cut in half, put into the porn star martini, given to the customer. They drink the drink, and then the glass goes back on the bar with half the passion fruit still in it, goes in the bin, goes to landfill, and decomposes and lets off greenhouse gases. So pretty much at all points of its journey, this passion fruit is a negative impact on the environment. So we worked with them to remove it and replace it with rice paper that gave a sustainability message. Ended up removing about 100 tons of passion fruit, and which had a pretty significant emissions reduction as well.
I love that it's using the rice paper, you say, instead of the actual fruit. Probably not so good for passion fruit suppliers. They're probably like, oh, curse the sustainability people for being so good. That you can actually create that, because, of course, vodka revs, as I used to know it, you're right, yeah, you're talking to the right audience. I think our audience probably are probably pouring themselves a glass of wine as they're listening to us now, right? They'll know a Revs cocktail, how iconic the porn star martini is as well, having that passion fruit. So to be able to sort of display that sort of message and make that massive saving, I think is incredible, really. Go revolution. I don't think I went as a uni student. I don't think I could afford it. I don't think I was their target market back then. I think I used to still go in and have a beer. Once I started earning a bit more money, thankfully, at Revolution. But as we touched on earlier, I suppose sustainability isn't just for the enterprises, is it? Or coming from investor pressure or anything like that. So it'd be great to hear about how Energise tailors its services to the unique needs of smaller enterprises as well.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, SMEs make up around 44-45% of non-domestic carbon emissions in the UK. So even though there's lots of them, still a cumulative large footprint to action upon. And ultimately, the end answer of how we support organisations, whether they're small or large, are the same. We want people to understand what they need to do, how do they do it, and then we support them and hold their hand as much as or as little as they like until they kind of achieve their net zero goals. The differences between large enterprises and small organisations is effectively regulatory pressure, legislation, and scrutiny that they may face from investors or other stakeholders. So what that allows us to do is we have a sustainability service that's aimed at SMEs. We call it Systemic, and it takes people on that same 4R journey, but just allows us to not have to create the kind of pages and pages of methodology that needs to go alongside a corporate customer's piece of work, because an SME doesn't need that to present to somebody to kind of read through and examine and audit, basically. Large organisations have got requirements to depends on how big they are, but they've got requirements to consider their climate-related risks and report on those into their annual report. Some of them need to assess their energy consumption every 4 years and understand how they make reductions on that. Some are required to disclose all of their sustainability efforts through various platforms. So all of that leads to having to have an answer that is accompanied by lots of detail, lots of methodology statements, lots of kind of open source, effectively kind of data. And an SME doesn't need that. So our approach with Systemic is to assess the footprint, come up with an action plan on how to reduce that footprint, and again the kind of renewable stuff, give them targets and an action plan to work forwards on, and then if they'd like to, an option to kind of offset through really good standard offsetting credits at the end.
Something I think that needs to be encouraged in SMEs, and maybe it's something I appreciate what it's like being an SME. You've got pressures from all these sides, but I think something that can be encouraged is that sustainability can be a really great, unique selling point for your business, and particularly if you are a startup, a scale-up. Some of the startups and scale-ups work with us. If you can build in sustainability from the outset and create your business sustainable by design, that gives you a lot of great advantages, particularly if you're in an industry that has been dominated by businesses that have been there for a while, for example, Adam, because they will probably be having to retrofit on sustainability, probably have to change a lot of relationships so that they're more sustainable, right? Because if you are moving to a more sustainable base, you are probably changing suppliers, changing the way you do things that might sort of put people's out noses. Whereas if you are a startup scale up, you've got the agility to be able to put sort of sustainability at the heart and soul of everything you do, Adam, right? Would that be something you'll be encouraging for the smaller businesses?
Yeah, it's a really important point, and bringing people on the journey, we need to not just focus on, we're telling you that you probably should do this because you're going to support the global net zero target. We have to sell all the other benefits, and in some cases, some of the risks that come with it as well. So, being a sustainable business is going to make you more commercially attractive. I mentioned before that younger people, so some of the, I guess predominantly kind of Gen Z and millennial generations, want to be more sustainable. So they want to buy products from sustainable organisations. So we've seen like success stories on the high street from the likes of Lush, who talk a lot about how they look after their people and buy ingredients from sustainable sources. And we see that kind of not only B2C but also B2B. So in the last couple of weeks I was at a conference where we had a stand with Energise, and we're an SME as well. We've got 44 employees, and we have B Corp certification. So a couple of years ago we were certified to be a good, sustainable company that's acting to be a force for good in environmental terms, in employee terms, in customer terms, in community terms. And of course we want to shout about that. And so we put that logo next to our logo on our kind of stand background. And the vast majority of people that spoke to us because we had that B Corp logo. And that was the opening conversation. We saw that you're a B Corp. Oh, we're looking to be a B Corp as well. How can you help us? So we know that being more sustainable works. It allows you to be more commercially attractive. There's other benefits as well. If you're buying less products to reduce your footprint, then you're not spending as much. So there's financial advantages to it as well. And also you've got, we kind of go back to the renew part of the 4Rs. If you're working with innovation and R&D with companies, they may give you some of these products for free because you're trialing it. So there's lots of advantages for small organisations to go on the journey, not just you're supporting the wider net zero target.
I'm delighted you raised being a B Corp, actually, because that's something we wanted to go on to in terms of when we talk about sustainability, everyone thinks of the environmental concerns, but something that's become sort of at the forefront of of great businesses' minds has been being more sustainable on a social footing. So I just want to ask you sort of what role should social sustainability play in an overall strategy, and why is it important to businesses? Because we've seen people, particularly post-COVID, be far more aware of their staff health. With the move to hybrid working has certainly impacted on this. How much do people talk to you about social sustainability?
Yeah, it's certainly a topic that's more predominant in people's conversations now. And again, if we kind of make this split of large organisations to small organisations, so you mentioned before about large organisations talking around CSR, and the social part of CSR kind of continues today, but it's gone further than maybe allowing your employees to have a day off work or providing kind of donations to organisations. It's looking at how do you ensure that you are have a diverse workforce, and with that diversity you're being inclusive of that workforce and providing everyone kind of equitable opportunities. And we've seen that somewhat recently in the last few years around the gender pay gap requirements, so large organisations reporting on that, and then I don't believe there's any requirement for anyone to do anything about it, but I think the reporting of it is kind of enough for people to say, if you're paying women 25% less than men on average and you're publishing that on your website, you're probably going to do something about it. But that's shifting potentially into the government considering how do we do pay gap reporting based on ethnicity and disabilities, so that we're looking at diversity as a wider set rather than just gender that may have been the regulatory requirement in the past. And then with smaller companies, obviously they're not going to have that kind of regulatory kind of pressure, but a lot of these organisations are doing this stuff anyway, because the cost of recruiting people and not retaining employees is probably quite significant for small organisations. So if you're providing a great workplace and a great culture for people to work in, they're likely to stay there, so then your overall costs are going to reduce from employment. And small organisations, lots of people want to work for small businesses because they have that culture already. There's already the typical things around, like, nobody really matters when you have time off work, where in larger organisations you've got to do full handovers and put a request in 6 weeks before, whereas small businesses can be more agile in that sense. So it's a really interesting topic, and it's really interesting to see how people are going to consider social as part of their wider sustainability plans, like you say, not just on the environmental front.
Do you expect this cultural mind shift, so sort of being far more aware of these things happening as in part due to a switch over in generations? So until now, very much the baby boomers and maybe Generation X and that sort of era are moving out of the C-suites, and you've got more millennials coming through now. Do you think are they more socially aware? Are they more environmentally aware? I suppose they've had more years of this type of persuasion and far more evidence now, right, and science to help them make these decisions.
Yeah, and I suspect there's a whole raft of, visibility things that have happened recently. So, because a lot of people are shouting about the sustainability things they're doing, it means that mainly younger people are able to see what competitors in their space are doing. So if you work for one large bank, but you see that another bank is providing a better culture, and maybe they've decided to not invest in fossil fuels, and that aligns with your values, you're more likely to move over to them. And I think we all kind of experienced that employee loyalty maybe isn't as strong as it has been in the past. Like, I know people in my family who joined an organisation at 16 as an apprentice, and they retired there at 65, 66. So they've been there for a good solid 50 years, and maybe when they leave they kind of get given a watch or something like that, a tie. But younger people don't want to do that. They want to move around because they get better experiences, they may, like I said, they may move to an organisation that's got a better culture and a better sustainability standing. Obviously, pay is a really important thing. Moving around, you get better pay. So it's, as an organisation, looking at social side of things, providing diverse or creating diverse workforces and inclusive workforces, building a really strong culture means that you're going to retain these employees and have really good talent.
And there's been some really dank memes about this go round, hasn't there, about the corporate we're a family type environment. So you would see that for a time, wouldn't you, on LinkedIn jobs, say, where it'd say, oh, we're a family, and it'd sort of list out the benefits, and it would be this many days off, and you'd look at it and it'd just be the statutory amount of days off, and it would be things like free fruit, maybe one low alcohol beer on a Friday. It's been amazing to see kind of that shift. I think COVID, particularly with the acceleration of work from home and hybrid, you had a lot of these businesses that had held out, the absolute stalwarts that said absolutely not work from home, who were kind of forced to do it. And actually, I've heard a lot of stories from businesses who actually, when they adjusted to it, and finally the imagined barriers from IT and everything else dissipated, they actually found that they really like it. I can think of a publishing house in particular who were adamant from a mindset culturally that no one could work from home. And actually, after a few weeks of it, they're like, actually, only come in when you really need to. We're going to get rid of the lease, and we're going to find other spaces, more creative spaces for you to work from. And this change in mentality, I've got a friend who works for a bank, and he said to me recently, it's not 3 days work from home anymore, Chris. It's 3 days where you can't work from home, right? So in his context, that will be, can you go to the office in Canary Wharf or wherever it is? But it's been incredible to see that shift, obviously, with COVID. And now there's a bit of a retracement where businesses are trying to get staff back in kind of after the horses have bolted, right? How do you get the horses all back in? But interesting from a sustainability perspective, because I'd have thought the knock-on effects of all these people not travelling around with COVID and stuff probably accelerated us towards targets, actually, Adam, did they?
Potentially. I think the post-COVID progress report from the Committee for Climate Change suggested that there was a bit of a dip, mainly in that kind of full lockdown period, but then after that, it wasn't significant enough. The technical answer is that yes, you don't have people commuting to work, but instead of having one office, you've now got 100 remote offices. And you've got people who weren't in their homes before who are now heating them, who are now running IT equipment, rather than that being one central office. So it's all of these kind of cultural change. I don't envy business leaders having to make those decisions, because at the end of the day, organizations or businesses still have a legal obligation as being limited companies to make profit. And if you start reducing productivity because of these cultural changes, or you make changes that impact production of that profit, you've got to really decide, is it the right thing to do? Is it going to upset a few people by asking them to come into the office 2 days a week rather than being at home 5 days a week? It's a really difficult position, and like I said, I don't envy business leaders having to make those decisions at all.
No, and I suppose even with lockdown, it didn't stop people like Dominic Cummings driving up to Barnard Castle, right? So the emissions were still there for that. But that's all in the past. We don't want to focus on the past. I'd like you to just take us into the future, show us your crystal ball, really, and just tell us what your thoughts are on the future for sustainability and how Energise in particular are preparing for upcoming trends and challenges that you must be seeing on the horizon, Adam.
So I'm hoping it's going to be a really exciting space, and there's no reason to doubt it won't be. I've spoken a lot about innovation in this, and there's lots of innovation to come out. There's new technology kind of what feels like every week at the moment. So our consultancy team get to bring that in and then kind of digest it and send it off to our customers to say, here's this new technology, you can maybe trial it, or it's ready for you just to fully adopt. And we all kind of get a bit nerdy and get into all the details, and my engineering side comes out and I get really into all the kind of data sheets and stuff. So it's going to be a really exciting space. We've recently seen universities kind of putting on degree courses that are focused on sustainability. So we're soon going to be seeing the outcome of that, and great talent coming into the space, which is quite difficult at the minute to find good sustainability experienced talent. I think there are two trends that I can see, and I think that Energise also accepts is going to happen. We've got digitalisation of the sector, I guess. We have got a huge amount of digital platforms that claim to do all sorts of things, and predominantly the main one is about reducing your carbon footprint, and they will connect into all your systems. You'll connect to your energy supplier, they'll connect to your QuickBooks or your Xero or whatever platform you use, and then spit out a carbon number, and then they may say, well, here's your carbon number, give us this much money and we can offset it for you as well. Sounds great. We've got concerns. We don't think maybe it kind of gets under the bonnet enough, and there's how do you apply different things. Personally in Energise, we've seen some cases where it's been difficult to measure that. So our co-CEO a few years ago bought some solar panels, and I think from EDF, and on one of these you spent X amount of thousands of pounds on solar panels with EDF, but these platforms go, oh, it's EDF, so it must be electricity and it must be gas, so they apply that rather than the solar panel emission factors. So AI is providing maybe some of a change to that, and is providing some of that kind of deep dive analysis, but we're not there yet. And then there's the rest of the journey. That may tick off the first R in our 4R approach, but it doesn't give you the other reduce and renew ones. It kind of gives you the rebalance one. How we're preparing for that is we have created our own platform, but we don't use it as a customer facing one. So our customers won't necessarily go into their Connect systems and spit out a number. We use our consultants still as the key part of that journey, and then the platform will be used as a presentation of the outcome, so they can kind of deep dive into the numbers. Oh, we've purchased all of this stuff. What are my emissions specifically from wood or from concrete or anything like that? And we can deep dive into the really individual numbers if they want to. And then it will provide their kind of overall sustainability journey as well. So how are they progressing to net zero? Eventually it'll have some social stuff in there, but it's less numbers with social, it's more doing. The other interesting trend is around standardization. At this point in time, there are not a huge amount of standards around sustainability, and that's led to a lot of organizations creating their own. Some of them are widely accepted, so the Science Based Target Initiative set a net zero standard, and a lot of organizations will align to that. But we've seen a lot of others over the years. Energise have tried to create one, and we decided it wasn't the right thing to do. The Carbon Trust, when they were owned by the government, they had their own Carbon Trust standard that we saw in kind of shop windows as stickers. There's all sorts of accreditation schemes, and what we need is a common international standard that says this is the definition of net zero, this is the definition of how do you consider that you are a net zero organisation, how do you measure against it, and at what point can you say we are net zero. And the same for social stuff, and the same for biodiversity stuff as well. I mean, the core focus now needs to be on net zero standards, and hopefully we'll get there in the coming years, and then we can start expanding standardization into the other areas of sustainability.
It reminds me a lot of our own journey at feedbackfans.com in terms of maybe 10 years ago. I think I had the exact same sort of reservations about our industry. There was a big push then for companies like Wix or build your own websites, right? Which is fine, that digitalization had come, but if you build a terrible website, it's not going to do anything for you. You might now have a website and you'll be able to say to people, I've got a website. How much did it cost you? Oh, it's free. Okay, well, it's probably free for a reason, right? Because you are missing out on, I think this is where a lot of startups particularly go wrong, is that if you're not going to spend on the expertise to help you with these things, and that can range from actually you should have a call to action here, not there, right? Just little nuggets of information that you probably won't pay for, but if you've got a friend who works in that space, they will help you out, to all the way of, okay, we'll manage this for you, what are your goals and objectives? And so I totally think that sort of premium approach is coming back, and people are willing to pay for that. We've seen that in a cycle here. So 10 years on from them being our concerns, I would say that the people who decided, oh, we're not going to host or do our marketing with you, Chris, we're going to do it in India because it's cheaper, have now come back. They've had that experience. We used to talk about being everyone's third web designer, and that would be because the first time they would do it, they'd do it themselves terribly. Second time they'd get their cousin to do it, and it would be slightly better, but terrible again, didn't work, right? So then they would come to us, and actually by that point they'd have a bit of a budget, a bit of a knowledge in what they're doing, and actually it'd be a better conversation for both businesses, you see. So I totally get those challenges. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time today. I think I must have about 10 more follow-up questions for you, but what I will do is put your social media in the show notes so that people can ask them to you directly. So just one last question for you for this last 4 minutes, which would be the question we ask everybody on the Bear Business podcast. I think it says a lot about people's approach to risk and business. I'd just like to ask you what your favourite game is. Can be a video game, card game, dice game, dominoes game, any sort of game really. What would be your favourite game go-to? Interesting.
So I'm not a big fan of video games. Not a big fan of being sat in front of a screen. Board games, also not a big fan of. I think my favourite game would be I guess a garden game. I'm probably going to mash up the pronunciation of this, but Molki. Which is I think it's Swedish, I think. But the aim of the game is that you have 12 skittles and then a cylinder throwing implement, and you set them out in the garden kind of together like you would with bowling pins. You throw the throwing implement at the skittles and you try and knock them down. The aim is to get 50 points. If you knock down one skittle, you get the points that are printed on the top, which are 1 to 12. If you knock down more than one skittle, you get the amount of points of the skittles that you've knocked down. So if you knock 5 skittles down, you get 5 points. If you go over 50, then you reset to 25 and you start again. The great thing is that the skittles spread out, so you don't reset them to the kind of central location every time somebody throws. So you end up going from this game that started in kind of 2-3 square meters, and you suddenly start expanding out into kind of 100 square meters because the skittles are just being flung everywhere. I think it's great because it's got loads of players, brings people together, great in the sunshine. But yeah, that would certainly be my favourite game.
I love that. I love the jeopardy of it. I love that you have to get it 50. I can imagine there's a lot of occasions are there where you're very close, and one of those games where you can sprint ahead, but actually you can find yourself, like me when I'm trying to play darts, try to hit a double, could be there all night. Make sure you get yourself a few Cokes in or a few sherbets because you're going to need them. So I try and hit this double 10 for forever. Yeah, I imagine it can be, how long would a game, if I played you at Molki, how long would you expect a game of Molki to go on for?
I think if you're playing with 2 people, you could probably have a good round, maybe 10 minutes. If you've got 8 people, and okay, you do have one of those jeopardies where the 12 pin is right next to the 1 pin, but you only need 1 point. You could go on for maybe half an hour, 40 minutes.
Do you have any hints and tips? Because when you mentioned it the other day, I've actually bought a set. I think my son at 6 months old is probably going to be too young for it, so I'll just be like, come on, hurry up, get older so we can play Molki in the garden. Have you got any sort of tips for the listeners? I'm sure sales of Molki are going to go flying through the roof now. Yeah. But any tips to help out our the Bear Business crowd?
I think the obvious approach would be to launch the cylinder at the one that you want to go for. I would suggest throw high and let it kind of come down on the skittle. Because if you've got a few in front and a few behind, you're going to get the one you need.
That's a great tip. We're going to go with that, Adam. Thank you ever so much for your time today. I'm sure we'll have you back on later on in the maybe later on in the year or next year, just to talk about how things are going with the small business propositions and any developments there. Try and give the Bear Business crowd a look in. Thank you ever so much for spending your time with us today.
No worries, thanks. Thanks, Chris. It's been a pleasure.